Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is J.D. Maddox, who is an expert in political warfare and an academic, writer, and former political candidate. He has served as a Central Intelligence Agency branch chief, deputy coordinator of the U.S. Global Engagement Center, advisor to the Secretary of Homeland Security, and as a U.S. Army Psychological Operations team leader. J.D. Maddox, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit with you about some of these issues. And I'm really proud to join the prestigious crowd of Cognitive Crucible participants over the past years. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, looking forward to chatting with you as well, JD. And your voice is a welcome contribution to the forum. So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, somewhat provocatively, perhaps, JD, will cover emerging IO opportunities. But before we get into this topic, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, the times in which we live?
Absolutely. So we're in a really unusual moment. What we've seen over the past few months with the arrival of the new Trump administration is this real reduction of capabilities in the information operations space. So that includes the loss of the U.S. Global Engagement Center, which was responsible for counter disinformation activities across the U.S. government and coordinating all of those. We've seen the loss of USAID, which included many programs which were focused on countering disinformation, but also creating resilience to other forms of information operations. We've seen the reduction or loss of USAGM's Voice of America and other outreach capabilities, meaning that we've potentially lost a way to reach out to foreign audiences and to position the US's image in ways that would benefit the US. So those are really significant changes in this environment. And I think that they are, at least loosely, they comply with this, the MAGA worldview and MAGA's complaints about what those organizations were doing. And so I don't think it should be much of a surprise, to be honest, that there was some action taken against those organizations. But I think there are really significant implications of their losses. So I think I think that their loss is sort of a magnet for, woe is me, we are going to fail, very negative positioning on how we're going to do this work. But I think that it's really important to think through, what do you actually do in this space now with the loss of those organizations and the sense that we're repositioning ourselves as a country against our adversaries and in favor of our allies. How do we adjust based on our actual capabilities, and what should we do differently? So I think that is a really useful thing to talk through. And I think that everything is moving. So what I'm going to say will sound a little bit provocative, but in fact, it's intended to be very pragmatic. And by the way, I'll give a trigger warning to the audience that my terms may not comply with DoD doctrinal terms if people are dead set on those terms. I'm a very lateral thinker, and my background is with, like you said, CIA, DoD, state, DHS, and other organizations. And so I'm thinking about the very big picture and how we integrate all those activities.
Okay. All right. Well, and also, by the way, to our audience, we're recording this on March 31st, 2025, to give everybody a time stamp if you're listening to this sometime in the future. And audiences might also go back and listen to another recent episode that we just had with a gentleman named Tom Kent, who unpacks and gives his perspective on the loss, whether it's short-term or permanent loss of some of those broadcasting outlets that JD was just talking about. JD, it dawned as you were talking, and we're also having a little bit of a pregame, so I'm the beneficiary of knowing some of the stuff that you're wanting to talk about. But I started thinking about the loss of these organizations that you were just talking about, USAID, or the great uh, the large changes that are underway with USAID, the Global Engagement Center, and so on and so forth. And the title of today's episode, New IO Engagement Opportunities. And so necessity is the mother of invention, right?
That's right.
When new things are needed, and not really, not just kind of like nice to have. Well, let's do some innovation because, what the heck, innovation can be one of those buzzwords that, like, oh, we always need to be innovating, blah, 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 right? But when you really need something new, when you really need to change, it's like, holy cow, this really does necessitate something new here. How do you drop that onto today's landscape? Like, we really do have to do something different, or dot dot dot.
Yeah, I think that we're overdue for new thinking in this area. So I think that we have been really thinking and working to create structures and to create doctrine that accidentally limit the way we do this work. And when we're confronted with these new limitations, and when activities and capabilities are stripped away, we have to think very deeply about how to adjust and how to be successful despite those losses. And I think that it's the losses are terrifying, and I feel terrible for people who lost their jobs. But this conversation, I think, moves away from that and starts to talk through, where is that opportunity that's required, and I think that's very healthy. And I hope that others will chime in and start to think about this in opportunistic terms, rather than in sort of defensive terms. So, one way to look at it, is from a storytelling perspective. In 2012, the PSYOP community conducted a very successful PSYOP activity against the Lord's Resistance Army. Lord's Resistance Army is this really terrorist group that existed in an area the size of Texas in Central Africa, led by Kony. And it became infamous for its recruiting practices, which included making children kill their own parents and then showing the children that they have a new family in the Lord's Resistance Army.
This is
Terrifying.
this is what time period, JD?
This was 2012 was when the
Okay.
PSYOP campaign happened, but the Lord's Resistance Army was around from the mid to late 80s.
Okay.
And really did extraordinary damage and disruption throughout that very large area. And so the U.S. PSYOP community had this task under the Obama administration to go after LRA, as they're called, and they did an extraordinary job of creating a primarily radio-based campaign to encourage defection from the organization. And they were able to engage with non-governmental organizations in Africa and affecting Africa who could support that campaign. And they were very effective at, demonstrably and measurably effective at encouraging those defections from LRA. And LRA really crumbled after that PSYOP campaign. But if we were to do the same thing today, I think what we're seeing in this space is that there's this retraction from Africa by the United States, right? So we've largely ceded that informational terrain to some traditional adversaries, especially China. So that's an issue. We have decreased the amount of funding through USAID and other organizations that might go to NGOs on the ground that could be effective in this space. And we continue to use traditional PSYOP structure and doctrine to think through how we're going to do this work. I think that those factors are very important, and we need to think about how to adjust to those today. And I think the way we do that is through really modifying the way we're thinking about PSYOP, IO, OIE, whatever terms you want to use. And again, my trigger warning to the audience is that I don't really care about the doctrine that much. I think it's much more important to be operationally effective using all capabilities and blending them very smartly.
Well, so you just gave a Africa example, but could the audience just as easily take that example and apply it to elsewhere globally, South America, other locations that we have seeded or are seeding the information fight globally?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a huge array of applications for that thinking. I think another example that is useful to think through is, in the fight between Ukraine and Russia a few years ago, the Ukrainians were extraordinarily successful in creating a ruse now called the Kherson Ruse, where they deceived Russian forces into believing that Ukraine forces would attempt a counteroffensive at Kherson, an area along the border, but instead they conducted a counteroffensive in an area called Kharkiv. And they were able to do that because they took advantage of Russian psychological vulnerabilities, this belief by the Russians that the counterattack would occur at Kherson, and they fed into that and created or initiated news articles and other media that indicated that, in fact, they would conduct a counteroffensive at Kherson, all the while they were planning on their action in Kharkiv. So, that kind of example is it deviates from what we saw with the Lord's Resistance Army. It's very different, but it uses techniques and tactics that can be applicable to what the U.S. community does in this space. And that ruse concept, that deception concept, is really a reflection of historical concepts that go back at least as far as World War II and elsewhere, otherwise.
Wow, cool. And while JD was talking, I was just looking up an article. So there's an article, the Kherson Ruse on this Ukrainian deception operation, co-authored by David Geo and Joe Littell, both of whom were previous Cognitive Crucible guests. So we'll have a link to that in the show notes for those who are interested in a little bit of a deeper dive into that operation. All right, well, you've painted a picture for us, JD, of things have changed, and now perhaps you can talk a little bit more about the kinds of things that you think people might be starting to think about in order to adapt to what we need to do.
Yeah. So, what we're seeing big picture in this space, and when we're talking about this space, the operations in the information environment, the environment for information activities, and how we participate in that as a government community, but also more broadly on the corporate side and on the non-governmental organization side. All of these capabilities have to be in play. But what we're seeing big picture is this movement from what we had previously seen with recent administrations to really an attempt to reposition the US government for great power competition, and really to think through opportunities for transactional wins. So, getting the U.S. to a place where it is perhaps no longer participating in information operations for the sake of information operations, or information operations simply to get the word out and to have persistent dialogue, but instead to position the information operations community for really targeted and measurably effective operations in this space in support of those transactional victories and those great power victories. So moving away from constant discussion on the airwaves and instead focusing down on how we integrate IO to support those great power shifts. That's a huge change, and requires new thinking, I think, about how we do this, especially when we've lost a number of organizations that were very competent and very effective in this space. So, the question is, what's left? How do we modify our operations to take advantage of adversarial vulnerabilities? How do we really shift to this new China focus at the risk of missing out on effective actions against Russia and other traditional adversaries? And so, what I think about this space is that, fundamentally, we have to take a new look at how we have organized ourselves. And I think traditionally we've created, function-based organizations that are dependent on fairly specific doctrine, whether it's the DoD level doctrine of operations in the information environment, or down to the 7-step PSYOP process. Those are fairly limiting concepts that require us to sort of salute the flag and undertake operations in support of those doctrines. I think that time for those doctrine-led operations is in question. I don't think it's passed, certainly hasn't passed, and doctrine is important, but it can't be a limitation on operations now. So I think that there are some great provocative things to talk through, John, that are useful for the audience. One, and back to the organization, I think that this new worldview will require us to undertake task-based activities instead of function-based activities. So to me, that means that we are shifting away from a necessarily hierarchical organization that is structured within a geographic-based AOR, and instead we are looking at what is the threat, what is the task at hand? Is it countering China's People's Liberation Army Navy activities in a specific area in the South China Sea? That is a task, right? So it's not about this nebulous concept of countering China, which is not possible. It's more about focusing down to the more specific task and orienting organizations, not a singular organization, but multiple organizations, to go after that task in unison. And I think that that's the break. So what's going to be required of a commander in the future is to adapt to this lower resource environment, where they're going to need to very creatively pull together a team and organizations that have the ability to collaborate against a specific task. And that, to me, even more specifically, means that you are integrating cyber capabilities, even from the corporate side, you're integrating social psychology capabilities on the psyops side. You're pulling in Madison Avenue to create extraordinarily thoughtful advertisements and other media. That's a new structure that's required to do that. And I think it's really important to start thinking through how to do that on the fly. And I think for people who reject that idea of task-based organization, think back to Operation Fortitude during World War II. That was a task-based organization. Convince the Nazis that you're going to land during D-Day at one place instead of another. And that required an extraordinary array of subtasks and sub-organizations that came together to focus on a specific task. So I think that's the new old, and we're going to have to get there again. So that's one. That's one thing that I think is worth thinking through for this broad community. Another is public-private operations. So I think that, the most recent model for effective operations in the information environment is the Ukraine model. And they have been very successful at pulling together a very broad array of civil society organizations, government organizations, and anybody else who will join the fight. And what you saw, right up front during the full invasion, if we're allowed to use that term anymore, is that Ukraine was very open to integrating even the most divergent organizations that were out there. So they included organizations like Anonymous when Ukraine government wanted to conduct cyber operations or wanted to conduct hack and dump operations or whatever else you have. And that was called, that has been called a hive model of operations for IO recently. And there are some indicators that hive model is changing over time as the war continues. But at its origins, there was this existential threat that drove and allowed this integration of operations that had really not been seen before, especially on the technological side. That idea that you would blend in and accept these unvetted technical operations in your national level activities was pretty wild. And I think that public-private model is something that really appealed to the broad IO community, but it has not been developed within our own IO community. So it's again, that's part two, and I think really worth thinking through that unhindered public integration. And there were hints of that within organizations like the U.S. Global Engagement Center, which was, intentionally worked to integrate some new technological capabilities, but never reached that sort of operational effectiveness that it was going after, in my humble opinion. So that's two. And then three, and possibly the most provocative and easiest to reject by rejectionists within the space, is that there have been, when the U.S. government has been under duress, or when it has had limited resources and limited capabilities in hand and in place under a standing military, there have been other ways that the U.S. has gone after its adversaries, including letters of marque. And these, go back to, they're written into the Constitution. So not extra constitutional. They are genuinely historically actual. So letters of marque essentially are permission slips for privateers to go after foreign ships. That's the classic model. But that same model could be used by or in the information operations community, where the U.S. Congress allows private companies to profit from offensive operations against U.S. declared U.S. adversaries, and that would be a huge shift and would open the environment to some new operations, and I think some very effective and rough operations. But also, it comes with extraordinary risk of, for example, misrepresentation of the United States, but
Mm.
also nefarious activities that were not intended by the United States under those letters of marque. So extraordinarily complicated. But I think if you're asking the question of how you integrate effective capabilities in this space, it's going to be a profit-based model. And I don't think that the US government has been very successful at very quickly adapting to new technologies and very quickly adapting to the new situations technically. And so this is a potential way to modify, or to level the playing field against adversaries who are very quick, such as the Russians or the Chinese, to use nefarious technologies against us, such as artificial intelligence
Hmm.
and other technologies. So
Yeah.
that's three, and I think it should raise questions. But I think and I would understand if it were rejected out of hand. But I also think that the question behind letters of marque is very important. How do you integrate novel capabilities? How do you integrate civil society and and corporate organizations who are functioning on a profit model, and
Hmm.
not simply ask them to volunteer themselves and their capabilities.
Yeah.
So that's three. And then fourth and final on my list, at least written list, is indemnification. I think that, you know, when there have been extraordinarily high risk operations that depend on contractors and depend on non-government personnel, those organizations have sometimes been given indemnity. And what indemnity means, very basically, is that first of all, there's a sense that that organization is not responsible for its support to the government. It's not responsible for the outcomes of its operations, but factually, indemnification means that the government will foot the bill when that supporting organization is sued, or that supporting organization is um, you know called up by the law for its activities. And that, again, major shift, kind of in the same ilk as letters of marque or letters of reprisal, and really would change the way that contractors and other supporting organizations do work in this space. I think that the fear of participation in this area by some contractors and others has been, that it can have a real impact on their corporate image, and it can have a bottom line impact on their
Hmm.
profitability over time. So indemnification moves away from that. It is not actually, again, just like letters of marque, it's not a novel thing. It's been out there for a long time. It's just not typically used in this space.
Hmm.
So John, that's four, and all of them are
Yeah.
explosive, and I think,
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. No, that's very, very provocative, and so I'm, seeing a, like a Venn diagram. There's overlap in all of what you were talking about, and the kinds of things that I was tracking along with is like, there's like a general criticism of today's DoD and national security policy and structure on the way we are currently employing influence. I'm hearing that throughout your discussion there, JD. Plus, perhaps accelerated civil military fusion, for appropriate for today's battle space, privateering and bounty hunters for specific tasks. And I had heard this, several years ago at a conference, but how corporations, well, especially with respect to cyber attacks, but corporations are, cyber attacks cost money for businesses, and so it's almost like the cyber engagements, the requirement to protect ourselves increasingly in the cyber world is like a big tax that's being put on goods and services because organizations have to preemptively spend money in order to harden themselves so that they can't get attacked. But then those costs just get passed on to consumers. So things wind up becoming more expensive due to today's the necessities of today's global engagements. In order to do commerce, you have to be hardened up in the cyber world. And so it's kind of I guess maybe a chicken and the egg kind of a thing. It's like in order to operate, you have to be able to protect yourself, but you're also being attacked unreasonably and so on and so forth. But this guy was making was positing, and like I said, this was like 5 or 6 years ago. He's like, businesses are going to get sick of this crap. Right. And it wouldn't surprise me if in the not too distant future, corporations go on the attack. If you're gonna mess with us? Okay, mess around and find out, right? And so I'm hearing that as well from your from your delivery there, JD. It's like, okay, you're gonna mess with us, and we're gonna attack you back. And so integrating that into our collective good, national security. So, um, yeah, that's good. I'm, there's not really a question in there, but along the lines, letters of marque, like you said, is written into our Constitution. Do you have any historical examples at the ready of when letters of marque have been employed by the U.S. government and what some of those outcomes were?
Yeah, they were typically used, in the 18th century.
Hmm.
Although I think the last letter of marque was at the end of the 19th century, and they were typically used for for privateers that
Hmm.
is privately owned ships to overtake ships that were coming into the United States delivering goods to the Brits or to an army that wasn't welcome by the
Hmm.
United States. And so they were very effective in operations. And, the intent was
Mm.
that the privateer was able to profit from that model, which made it a lucrative business. Um,
Hmm.
but I think uh, your previous discussion, John, like you didn't ask the question, but you made huge implications, and I think that's really good. My response to the implication is that yes, we will have to wildly adjust what we're doing in this space, and I think that's to our advantage. I think that, for example, China is probably expecting a a conventional and a predictable operation by the United States and its allies. And one way to destabilize China's plan, China's People's Liberation Army Navy, is to focus on the unconventional and to play them at their own
Hmm.
activities short of war. They are conducting irregular warfare right now,
Hmm.
and I think we need to think through the opportunities to do the same kind of irregular warfare, and specifically information operations that take advantage and again destabilize, pull China off balance in this space, take advantage of China's actual vulnerabilities you know, instead of focusing only on conventional operations against them.
Yeah. I will drop this into the show notes, but according to Wikipedia, there was a 20th century example of a letter of marque in the early World War II period, and people can read about that with the Goodyear Company, something to do with the usage of blimps in World War II. I'm just kind of scanning as I'm talking here, and there's also a entry in Wikipedia about reconsideration of using letters of marque as recently as 2007. Ron Paul brought something to the congressional floor to consider using letters of marque and matters related to piracy. So it
Well,
is it is kicking around.
it's even more recent than that.
Yeah.
I actually discussed letters of marque opportunities with congressional offices to understand their position on it much more recently, a few
Hmm.
years ago, trying to understand, what's the reality behind this, and is this an actual feasible concept? And I think at the time there was great resistance to the idea,
Hmm.
but I imagine that this current administration has a much different view of that, and is probably thinking, you know, very creatively. That's a specific word, very creatively, about how it can be active in this space, and take advantage of new technology, take advantage of new techniques,
Hmm.
and that's probably so. There's probably been a shift on its potential use.
Yep, yep. And further down the same Wikipedia page, most recently it talks about Senator Mike Lee is mentioned with respect to letters of marque and addressing the Mexican cartel problem. So it is a live topic for sure. Um, uh, do large multinational organizations have their own private militaries or something like that? Like, I don't know, SWAT teams or, tough teams that go in and pursue organizational goals in a less diplomatic manner already.
So most there may be that model in place by
Uh-huh.
very large organizations, but
Yeah,
what
yeah,
I'm
I'm talking about like the really big multinational players. Yeah.
what I'm seeing is that that paramilitary
Yeah.
organization has shifted to a essentially an Uber model, which
Hmm.
is,
Oh, is that right?
yeah. So there are, uh, deniable systems online that
Hmm.
allow you to essentially dial up a mercenary. So,
Ah,
so
that's the word I was thinking of, mercenaries. Yes. I mean, this is my limited knowledge about these kinds of things. So, audience, bear with me. But I think Blackwater, and I mean, maybe the people in Blackwater be like, no, 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 that's not us. I don't know, but organizations for hire that can go in and do things that in the pursuit of whoever's paying for it, their goals.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, that wouldn't be the first time something like that was done. I mean, you could think all the way back to, you know, Ross Perot trying to save hostages.
Mm, mm,
It's been done, um, but a very perilous area for companies to dabble in. I don't think you'd want to associate your company name with something like that.
mm,
There's very little upside unless you are a professional mercenary company, in which case that is the reason for being. But
mm,
it remains a really dark space.
mm. Well, so uh, this the title again of the episode is, IO opportunities. So, I mean, given everything you were just talking about, are you bullish on mercenary companies? Like, if looking forward into this kind of a engagement laydown, would mercenary companies be uh, is it a good time for mercenary companies?
I so that's two different questions, and I'll be really clear.
Hmm.
So I am not bullish on mercenary companies. I think
Okay.
there are
Okay.
limitations to what they can do, and the risk for extrajudicial, extra-constitutional activity is probably too great right now. But I think that mercenary companies are a fact,
Mm,
and so they need to be considered when we're thinking through operations, and whether it is how do we limit the use of mercenaries? How do we defend against non-traditional or mercenary activities overseas, such as Wagner and others from the Russia side? But also, I think it would be really short-sighted not to consider their use in unconventional operations. They are a deniable capability. They're also something that can be ejected pretty quickly by a policymaker, and that is their appeal. But I think that they remain extremely perilous organizations right now.
mm, right. Um, Anything else we haven't touched on, JD, that you think it would be a fruitful part of the discussion, or any wrap-up comments?
I think the wrap-up comment is simply that our mindset has to, if we're supportive of the US government consistently, then our mindset has to match the current administration's mindset in order
Mm,
to understand how to be effective in this space. And so when we're thinking through information operations, it's useful to think through that great power competition concept and the transactional nature of the new administration's position on those things. I can argue, and we could get into a multi-year argument about the righteousness of what the new administration is doing. I think that's fairly irrelevant for thinking through how you actually organize and create opportunities against adversaries, given the realities of the new administration. So I don't want to walk away with anybody thinking that I necessarily support all the policies that are in place. I think there are gaps and limitations and real mistakes to what's going on right now. But I'm offering this as a new way to think through how we actually are effective, given that we are directly confronted by adversaries in this space that
mm,
require us to do something significant and to do it differently than we've ever done it, given changes to the information environment.
mm,
So this is a very pragmatic exercise in this discussion, and I don't mean to come off as being
hmm.
um, you know politically partisan in any way.
Right, right. Now, you said it right at the end. That was exactly what I was thinking is pragmatism. It's you know, you can have your own opinions on the way things are going down at the moment, but it it is what it is. That is what's happening, and regardless, there's always opportunity, and it's identifying the opportunity that exists and that is emerging and continuing on. Uh, um, I like to think of myself in, not in a silly way, but in a very literal way, a happy warrior. I tend to think of myself as an optimist, and just like fight the good fight while appreciating and being grateful for the things that I have in my life, my family. I'm a retired Marine officer, and I believe in the Western Enlightenment project. I think that we are beneficiaries of, many brave people who have bestowed who have delivered to us this world that we live in currently, and I think it's worth fighting for. So, um, yeah,
Well,
yeah,
I agree with you, and I like that perspective, John. I think that I think that the defeatist viewpoint seems to predominate on the
hmm
airwaves and in conversation, and I don't like it.
yeah,
I like
yeah,
solutions. I like opportunity. I like looking for those challenges and solving them. And I think this is a moment to rise to
hmm
the occasion.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Wow. All right. Well, JD Maddox, you've given us a lot to think about, and to be continued, obviously. And with that, JD Maddox, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you for having me very much.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.